Kate Lines joined the OPP in 1977 and had a career that saw her work undercover and involved in several high-profile cases like that of the abductions and murders of Kristen French and Tori Stafford and the abduction of Michael Dunahee. Kate details what those experiences were like in her new book. It is called Crime Scene: From Patrol Cop to Profiler, and Kate Lines is with me here now. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So
Pia.
let's go back to '77. There you are, Kate Lines, and you joined the OPP. Why'd you want to do it back then?
Why did I want to do it? It's, I guess, a different. Certainly in an era when there wasn't too many women in policing. I'd attended the University of Toronto. I liked the sort of criminal justice area, a couple of courses that I took. Thought that I might actually pursue a law career, but unfortunately I was a little overactive in the extracurricular activities of college life, played on a few sporting teams that traveled, and unfortunately my marks weren't as good as I hoped. But my roommate in college, her cousin was a police officer, and so I was visiting her cousin with her one day here in Toronto, and he started talking about it, and I thought, this is something I want to give a try, see how it goes. So I did, and 33 years later, I retired being a police officer.
And you said, you know, wasn't a lot of women back there. What are we talking about? How many women were in the force?
Oh, there's about 50 women. This was 1977. I think it's about 50 women at the time. They joined the OPP starting in 1974. The opportunities were offered to women. Prior to that, they were not. Only were available to males. So some of my colleagues, as soon as I joined the force, were women who were in those very first classes, and a lot had even changed from till the time that I joined. A lot had changed. So,
okay, things have changed, but we're 3 years into a force that didn't have women in it before. There's only 50 of you. It's a man's world, so to speak.
Yes.
What was the climate like for you and your other female officers?
I found myself, I was, my first posting was to Port Credit Detachment, which is just in Mississauga, west of the city of Toronto. And many of my workmates were younger individuals like myself, and I didn't have any difficulties at all. I mean, initially, the coach officer that I was assigned apparently was going to create some problems, him working with a woman at home. So I was reassigned to another officer, and that officer was more than I could have ever hoped for, and a mentor, a colleague, and a friend even to today. So all things worked out.
50 women? Do you know how big the force was at that time?
I'm going to say probably around 3,000 to 4,000 at that time.
So we're talking very,
very few women.
Okay, so here you are, Kate Lines. You're young. You're a new officer. You're one of 50 women. What kinds of cases are you getting assigned when you worked undercover?
Oh, when I worked undercover, okay, so that was I was in uniform for about 4 years. So the undercover assignment was the first a woman to be a full-time undercover officer in the OPP. So interesting as well on the job ad that you had to be unmarried, which of course, that's why I say a lot of things have changed to today. But yeah, that was obviously totally different from my experience in uniform, because now I was trying to persuade people to do things they wouldn't normally do. Most of my work was drug enforcement. So enforcing Canada's drug laws and making undercover buys, that kind of thing. And of course in uniform you had a firearm, a billy stick back in those days, and when you're working undercover you don't have anything.
And as a woman, because you're the first one to do this, I mean, are there stories that stick out for you where, you know, there were assumptions made about you're a woman, you can do this, you can't do that? Is there something that stands out for you?
Well, what stands out for me is how easy it was, and that was probably a little surprising to me at the time. But again, as much as my colleagues, male officers in policing and in other organizations, the same for people who are selling drugs and criminals, is they weren't used to women being police officers. So I've described it in my book, some days like taking candy from babies, because it was just, they never anticipated that you would be a police officer.
They never suspected you.
Never suspected. They might challenge you on it, but never suspected that really you were.
Right. So they were like, who's this? Who's this woman? They can't be a police officer, because women don't do this.
Well, and I would sometimes be with male police officers working as a partner, say in a particular project that we'd have somewhere in the province, and the criminals would say, well, I'm not going to sell to you, but I'll sell to her, because I know she's not a cop.
Right.
They still get arrested at the end of the day.
Sure. Sure. You worked on as a police officer for more than 3 decades.
Yes.
When you look at, and we hear a lot about this in the news, the difficulties, the challenges, the celebrations of women in law enforcement. How different, when you look at law enforcement today, how different do you think it is for women today?
Well, I think certainly the acceptance and maybe the pressure on the women hopefully has lessened. And I know, and about talking to some of my colleagues in those early days, especially those that went north to very small rural communities, some of them felt they had some difficulty in kind of adapting, not only in their workplace, but even into the communities. Because again, as I say, they're small populations, that type of thing. But today, when I, and I know many of the women, even till today in the police force, their experiences are one usually of acceptance from their coworkers and in their communities. And the OPP's had a commissioner, a female commissioner, several years ago. So certainly a lot of things have changed over the years.
Okay, so here you are, you're an undercover police officer with the OPP, and you decide, hey, I'm going to go off to Quantico, Virginia. You're going to go to the FBI's criminal profiling program. So tell me about that transition for you.
Well, I had been working undercover for a number of years, and then prior to this position with the FBI coming available, I had been working in our frauds, white-collar crime area. And I was looking again for something new. I'd spent some time in this other sort of job in transition. And when that ad came out, I really had no idea what criminal profiling was, but I'd gone to university.
What year is this?
This is 1990.
Okay.
Is when I went there, and I came back in 1991. But there was none of these TV programs or there's movies or anything like that, which, of course, some of that happened while I was actually at the FBI Academy. But I just knew from my background and my education that I had an interest in this area. And I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It was 10 months away from home, which was, I was living with a fellow at that time. So that was something that I wanted to make sure was okay with him, and it was. So I just decided to just dive in and check it out and see what I could learn.
So this is, as you say, the early 90s. It's not a time where we have all these movies, Silence of the Lambs, and other things that we get to know, at least the Hollywood version of the Kate lines. You come back to the OPP. So bridge those two experiences. What did you learn at the FBI school there that you brought back to the OPP?
Well, certainly the FBI's perspective, or their behavioral sciences unit, and that's where I was assigned to work. There were 7 of us. We were an international class. That was the largest class that ever trained, was 7 police officers at one time. But basically, the first process was to steel yourself or learn how to manage stress, because the cases that we were going to look at would be the worst of the worst. And it wouldn't be just reading reports. We would be looking at photographs, audio tapes, videotapes, that kind of thing. So the FBI wanted to make sure that we were ready to take that on. And I think certainly being in a class of 7 others, it was nice to sort of have others to decompress with, because it was really, as I say, it was horrific, but yet it was an opportunity to learn about these cases that unfortunately were happening in all of our home locations, and to look at them from a behavioral perspective. So traditionally, police, homicide investigators, sexual assault investigators would be, of course, relying upon, victim statements or witnesses or forensics or autopsy, all these different reports. But this was a behavioral perspective, and that's what, over that 10 months, I learned, is how to analyze a crime scene. Forensics was important, and knowing the investigative information, but to try to analyze what happened within that crime to see if that might be able to be indicative of the type of person that would be responsible for the crime. And therefore, if the police had a good idea of the type of person, it might help them prioritize suspects. I guess from a practical standpoint, investing their money as best they could is look at this type of an individual first. Or, for a variety of reasons, whether later on in interviewing them when they were arrested, or even, and in cases I was involved in, is helping prosecute those cases when they come to court.
We're going to talk about some of the cases, but I want to stick with you for a couple more minutes. You go on this course for 10 months. As you said, you see the most, and it's not to take police officers, people who work in the justice system, see horrific things all the time in courts. They deal with terrible things. So you've had some experiences processing that. But this is, as you say, the worst of the worst.
Yes.
here you are, grew up in a small town outside of Peterborough.
Yes.
Is there a link? Like, how did you learn how to manage all this? I get that you were trained, but not everyone can cope with this. When you think back to who you were growing up and through those years, is there a reason you think Kate Lyons can handle this?
Well, I think even from a very young age, I had a very strong mother. I mean, I loved my mother and my father dearly, but a very strong mother who always encouraged you to take on things, to tackle things, to not sort of back down. She was one of the reasons why I became a police officer, with her, as I say, particularly her encouragement. So I think that gives you a foundation of, you know what, if it's not for you, you can always change, right? That's why I say about nothing venture, nothing gain. I've always taken that approach in many of the different jobs I've had, especially when you had a job that you really liked and now you have an opportunity to do something different. Is it something that I really want to do? So I think from that perspective I think I always had the confidence I could handle it. I had the family background, I had some education, I had these FBI agents that around that were sort of walking me through it with others. Through that program, but yeah, certainly dealing with, especially those, particularly the worst, the young children who would be sexually abused and physically abused. Some of those cases, I mean, you just, to me, I learned how to compartmentalize it. And there were some times, and I do again talk about it in the book, where I had some blips of I needed to take a step back. Could just know that my body and my mind needed a break from the work, and then took some time away from it, and then was able to come back into it again. Okay,
we're going to talk more about you, but I want to talk in a bit. I want to talk about some of the cases. You worked on some very high-profile cases, the abduction, the murder of Kristen French. How did you end up working on that case?
Well, that case actually was fairly soon after I came back from Quantico, and Niagara Region Police and some other area police forces were involved in that case. But I got a call after several months. The investigation was still unsolved, and the investigators wanted to do a TV show to garner information more. And actually, there was a lot of rumors, so they wanted to do this television show. So I worked with the producer of the television show on how to set it, as did many others. I was just one voice at the table, but to really work on that TV show and what we could do. It was called The Abduction of Kristen French.
Okay.
And there was her parents were interviewed. Some of her school friends were interviewed. At that time, we were really concerned that there was people that were not coming forward with information. But I think the big thing there is with all of those types of appeals, and even today when families are speaking publicly, especially if their loved ones still not knowing what's happened to them or are missing, you actually know that you probably stand a fairly good chance that the offender responsible is watching too. And that was not lost on us in that particular TV show. And we would learn after the arrests of the two individuals responsible that they did in fact watch the show.
You say you knew that. What is it in your training that this is just what people do?
Well, just because they want to know what are we getting away from? Are they close? Are we, right. I think it's a sense of security, perhaps, if they think the police are, not on the right trail or whatever. But that's a very common thread in a lot of cases where after the fact, if you have an offender that's being candid with you, they're watching those TV reports. They watch the 6 o'clock news. They watch the 11 o'clock news as the investigation is unfolding to see if police are getting close.
What the heck are you saying to this family at this point?
Well, I didn't have a direct relationship. You mean with the family of Kristen French?
The victim's family.
Or with the victim's family. The victim's family was actually a part of this particular production, but really we're saying to them, as we do again with cases today, this is an opportunity to make your loved one not just a name and a photograph on a news program, but here's who they really are, to elicit emotion about what's happened, perhaps with someone who is yet to call police, maybe even an offender. And there's a case from British Columbia where one of those appeals was made several years ago, and the offender brought the child back. So it does work. 1 in a billion chance maybe, but it's enough.
Okay. So then you and your colleagues tie the disappearance of Kristen French to Leslie Mahaffey.
Yes.
make that, where's that link?
Well, that link was certainly from the investigator's perspective, that was a traditionally forensic link. There was geographic commonalities, victim selection, what we would call victimology. The victims were similar in age and appearance and that type of thing. The communities were not far from one another.
It all makes sense, if I can put it that way, when you look at it in hindsight.
Yes.
When you're looking at it at foresight, this is a different picture. I mean, you can put a puzzle together better once you know what the picture is. You don't even have a map of this puzzle at this point.
No, and that's why in that particular show was called The Abduction of Kristen French. And the moderators and the officers, the lead investigator, made it very clear to the audience that they were talking about Kristen French, but they knew there was a possibility that this crime was connected to Leslie Mahaffey, her abduction and murder as well. But we talked mostly in that program about Leslie because we had the most information about her case.
And you talked about when you're in Virginia at the profiling program, you're trying to come up with, you're learning about what type of person might commit these crimes. So give us the practical application of this. So there you have two victims. There's similarities that you talk about. What are you gathering? What are you knowing about the kind of person who may be committing this at this point?
Well, I think in that particular investigation, we knew there was two people responsible. Well-meaning witnesses thought they saw two males. We would learn later, months later, that in fact it was a male and a female.
Yeah.
So we have a team there, and that's a very unique situation in a violent crime. I mean, that does happen, but it tends to be when you have those types of individuals, you have a stronger one and a little bit weaker, or perhaps more subservient one. And we talked about that in that TV program that I mentioned. And we really tried to use some emotion, as I said, in the show, having the family and in that case, Kristen French's friends talk about her, to elicit emotion. A target there wasn't the predominant offender, it was the one that was perhaps more emotional about what happened. That in fact we found out there was some emotion, certainly didn't negate what would be her responsibility in the crime, but some of that did sink in, so those efforts were worthwhile.
Well, there are other cases that leap to mind, but perhaps not as, prescient as Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. And we, as Canadians, watched horrified as what happened. I just want you to give me a sense of what it's like being, I don't want to say the center of these things, but being involved in trying to figure out what happens in these cases. What is that like?
You know what, I think you're so focused on your job, and of course these investigations are always large. Anytime there's a missing child or any, sort of large, a number of different police forces get involved, they work together, that kind of thing. But everybody has their job to do. And then when I think back on those cases, in comparison to today, I was very focused on my job as a criminal profiler. I wasn't there to liaise with the family. I wasn't there to do any of the forensic work. I was there strictly to provide a behavioral perspective. And I think that focus is sometimes what helps that. And as I mentioned before, that compartmentalization is you're just so focused on your job that sort of the emotion and everything, you can't allow it to kind of drift in. And that's what helps you get your job done. But we have, pediatric nurses and pediatric doctors who are dealing with these life and death situations every day. And I think it's the same kind of thing, is you just really focus on your job. You can't start to cry in the middle of an operation because it's so serious. And I think some of that just sort of transfers over to these other jobs.
It's called coping.
Yeah, I guess it is. You're right. You're right.
Out of Bernardo comes this the violent crime linkage, I want to get it right, analysis system.
Yes.
VICLAS. Remind us what that is.
Well, VICLAS, an RCMP officer was the first to go to Quantico, so I was very close to him when I returned, because there was just two of us in Canada. Ron McKay was his name. He was in Ottawa, and I was in Toronto. And Ron worked with developing a computer program that could not only just look at crimes forensically, but behaviorally. So this, for the first time, police officers were being asked to, these are like DNA, all these things, all these pieces of forensic information are collected, but we wanted to know the behavior. So it was a questionnaire that officers would fill out about the physical, the sexual, and the verbal behavior that are occurring within crime scenes, because we know that those types of behaviors are usually consistent over time and space. So if you think back to the Bernardo case, what was happening in Scarborough, the sexual, the verbal, the physical behaviors of multiple sexual assaults of young women, stopped. But then they started in another location. But police officers didn't have a mechanism to share that information. So in Vi class, you know, there was a lot of questions after the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and of course Tammy Homoka as well, is what can be learned from this investigation. And so one of the things is to make Vi class mandatory for police officers. So today you have hundreds of thousands of cases in the Canadian database, and literally hundreds of success stories where now might not necessarily identify the offender that's responsible for the crime, but it's saying, you here at police agency, you need to talk to this police agency that's maybe 25 miles away, maybe is 2,025 miles away, but very similar things that used to be happening to you are now happening to us. And is there a chance that these cases are connected? Might not identify the person responsible, but let's work together to see if we can solve it.
It seems so commonplace now, like even as a layperson, it's like, well, haven't we been doing this forever?
Yeah. But you know, an age of, you know, at the time, Vi class was in place at the time when Leslie and Kristen went missing, but it wasn't being used. You know, a lot of people, I don't know about these computers. You know, it's very early on. You have to remember.
What can they help us do? Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas today, so much of what we do, and so much of my later career, was involved in developing technology to help in these kinds of cases. So, and I would never have thought of that during my time in Quantico.
Okay, something else that seems very commonplace to people nowadays are sex offender registries.
Yes.
You were involved in starting the first one of those
Yes.
as well, weren't
Yes.
you?
Yes.
How'd that one come about?
Well, I had been involved in, as I say, developing other technology. So we had geographic profiling, we had Vi class, we had some other databases, and a behavioral sciences unit that was formed in the OPP in 2005, and I was the manager of that unit at the time. And back in 1988, a little boy by the name of Christopher Stevenson had gone missing from a mall in Brampton, Ontario, just northwest of Toronto. And the person that would later be found to be responsible for his abduction, his assaults, sexual assaults, and his murders was someone that had been released in the community, but nobody in that particular community, through some glitches, weren't aware that he was living in that community. And certainly if they had, where this young boy was abducted from, this offender lived very close by. So in today, if you move forward to today, there would have been a door knock at that house within probably, I'm going to say 20 minutes to a half an hour, because of a sex offender registry that we now have in this country. So the sex offender registry came about and was named after Christopher because it was a number of inquest recommendations around getting one of these registries. They existed in the US. Here we don't release the names of the individuals who are in that registry, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have one of the highest compliance rates of offenders registering in the world, which seems to hover between 96 and 98%.
You're kidding me.
Which is like any time you talk, in Europe or in the US,
yeah.
That's just unheard of. But we have an investigative unit, and police, we have a very progressive database that lets anyone in the province of Ontario, and there now is a national database, somewhat similar, but we've so far kept ours here in Ontario because police officers can access the information directly. But it lets a police chief know, say at 6 o'clock in the morning, he can log on and go, oh, we've got a sex offender or who hasn't registered yet. And the first guys on the shift or gals are out making a door knock wondering why he's not re-registered.
Your book is fascinating. I mean, your job is fascinating. I know people have told you this through your career. And there are some people who will pick up your book because of that, because they're fascinated by this interesting job that you do. But at the end of the day, why do you want to put it down all on paper? What do you want us to take away from your book?
Well, I guess I wanted to share my stories. And I mean, I have a lot of tragedies in my stories. But there's always those uplifting moments, whether provided by police officers or police officers' family members or victims themselves in some cases, or the surviving family members of victims that are no longer with us. And there were really good stories of, in my opinion, hadn't been told a lot before. We always hear about, and you know, people often will ask me, well, what about so-and-so offender, and are they living in Quebec, or are they living in the Caribbean or whatever? And I've always kind of thought, yeah, okay, I can understand your interest. How come you don't ask how the families are? How come, you know, there just didn't seem to be that awareness of how do these families move on. And I think really that's the story that I wanted to tell, but I didn't realize when I started to write how at the end of it all, how cathartic it would be for me that for some of these families I didn't meet them till later on in my career, and some I had never met. So when I started to write this book and wanted to tell their stories, some families I was meeting for the first time, and they have beautiful stories and beautiful memories of their loved ones that they're not going to allow how they were taken away from them to be you know, the foremost in their memories. And I thought, you know what, if that's the way they look at it, that's the way I want to look at it.
Good talking to you. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you.
Thanks for breaking down so many barriers.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.